welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining the launch event for the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity's new Agentic AI Risk Management Standards Profile, a report that examines the unique risks posed by Agentic AI and introduces approaches for assessing, managing, and mitigating those risks. I am Nada Madkour. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm the interim director for the AI Security Initiative at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. And today's panel is going to explore how agentic AI risk management differs from general purpose AI risk management and what it will take to develop and deploy agentic AI systems in a safe and secure manner. All right, so first we are going to start with the welcome and introductory remarks, which we just did. And then we're going to have a short presentation by Deepika Raman exploring or giving a brief overview of the agentic AI risk management profile. Then we're going to move on to the panel Q&A and then take some audience questions if time permits, and then our closing remarks. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists and our presenters today. You're going to get a presentation from Deepika Raman. Deepika is a non-resident research fellow with the AI Security Initiative housed at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. She leads the center's work on AI risk thresholds for frontier AI. Her previous work includes developing participatory LLM evaluations at MIT CSAIL, building the responsible AI initiatives at the India AI Mission, as well as projects on open government data and digital public infrastructures. And we have our panelists, Alan Chan. Alan is a research fellow at GovAI, and his research interests include AI agents, transparency, and social resilience. He obtained his PhD from Mila Quebec AI Institute. Alan is currently serving as a member of the EU Transparent AI Systems Working Group with a focus on providing expert feedback on marking AI agent actions and content. We also have our panelist, Marta Bienkowicz. I hope I pronounced that right. Marta is a policy and partnership manager at the Cooperative AI Foundation. She is a certified tech steward and an affiliate of the Center for AI Digital Policy and the Z-Spectrum Trustworthy AI Initiative. She was an active member of the EU GPI Code of Practice working groups and also currently serving as a member of the EU Transparent AI System working groups, with a focus on providing expert feedback on marking AI agent actions and content. We also have Benjamin Larson. Benjamin is an AI governance and safety leader focused on shaping international frameworks for responsible and trustworthy AI. At the World Economic Forum, he leads global initiatives on AI safety, governance, and policy coordination, and manages the Safe Systems and Technologies Working Group, where he focuses on AI agent assessment, evaluation, and governance. He also manages the Global Future Council on AGI, focused on advancing alignment on emerging risks, standards, and oversight mechanisms. And last but not least, we have Crystal Jackson. Crystal is a non-resident research fellow at the AI Security Initiative housed at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. She was the lead on our recent publication that processed a structured approach for developing and evaluating AI cyber risk thresholds using Bayesian networks. Crystal has experience spanning the federal government, industry bodies, and think tanks, where she led initiatives to evaluate agents, quantify risks posed by frontier models, and facilitated multi-stakeholder safety standards. All right, and now we can move on to our panel. Oh, my bad. And now I'm going to hand it off to Deepika Raman for the presentation. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am very excited to introduce the Agentic AI Risk Management Standards Profile that went live earlier today, and take you through why it was developed, what it covers, what distinguishes the approach. This will be a super concise overview so that we don't take away too much time from the panel. First, I want to quickly explain what the motivation to create this profile was. Mainly that current risk management approaches weren't sufficiently addressing the unique risks posed by agentic systems. The first limitation being that model-centric approaches do not, are more traditional and focus primarily on model training, evaluation, and static behaviors. However, once models are embedded into autonomous systems, risk is shaped a lot more by the way these systems are configured and deployed. Secondly, agentic systems introduce more system level and interaction-based risks. This could happen when Agents are coordinating with other agents, are delegating tasks, or just operating across multiple tools and services. Risks tend to propagate and compound. This can lead to cascading failures, feedback loops, and emergent behaviors that are difficult to anticipate through isolated testing alone. And finally, in agentic systems, the increasing levels of autonomy complicate accountability and control. It becomes really hard to attribute actions, determine responsibility, and intervene effectively, particularly when they operate at speeds that far exceed the ability for human oversight. Taken together, these factors sort of indicated the need for a framework that treats risk as an emergent property of autonomous systems rather than solely as a property of individual models, which is what inspired this profile. Next slide, please. Very quickly, when we created this profile, we designed it to be practical and implementable while remaining consistent with established standards. This is why the profile is designed to complement the NIST AI risk management framework, but it also builds on UC Berkeley's general purpose AI risk management standards profile that we've been working on for the past few years. In terms of the scope, the guidance reflects the sort of diversity of current and emerging agentic architectures, and it covers all these different types of agent systems that you see listed here. I hope you can't hear the ambulance going off in the background. And finally, in terms of the audience, we intended for this to be guidance for developers, deployers, agentic, evaluators, policymakers, and essentially anyone assessing whether these systems are being designed and operated responsibly. Overall, our goal here is to provide shared technical and governance framework that organizations can meaningfully implement in practice. Next slide, please. Some of the things that I want to highlight from our profile is the characteristics that we sort of establish upfront that distinguish agentic systems. These include the level of causal impact of an agent's action, its role and function within a system, other factors like reliability, modality, and the access patterns when it comes to tool use. Most importantly, we consider the characteristics of agency, authority, and the type and complexity of the environment that they operate in. And specifically, these characteristics sort of show how risk management expectations must scale with these properties, and we treat in our profile agency more as a spectrum than just a binary to reflect this to reflect the different risks that it comes with. Some of the unique risks that we tackle in this profile include loss of control risks. This could be from oversight subversion, or just, once again, the sheer velocity of operating outputs outpacing monitoring and response mechanisms, automated R&D risks, misuse through large-scale automation, privacy and security vulnerabilities, deceptive behaviors, and emergent misalignment in multi-agent settings. Finally, we also highlight several risk management levels. These include clear mechanisms for human oversight and accountability with defined roles, escalation pathways, and shutdown procedures. Recognizing that agent behavior may evolve over time, the profile also emphasizes on continuous monitoring and post-deployment oversight through logging and tracking. Finally, it also includes system-level risk assessments, particularly with respect to tool use, environmental access, and multi-agent interaction. Together, these levels, we hope, will support more effective oversight, intervention, and accountability throughout the AI system lifecycle. I want to wrap up by saying that much like our general purpose AI profile, this too is intended to be a living framework. Given the rapid pace at which this tech develops, we believe that effective risk management for agentic AI must be iterative and adaptive rather than static or checklist-based. And I'm super excited for this brilliant panel to sort of dive into some of those details for us. Thanks, Nara.
Thank you so much, Deepika, for that overview. Yeah, now we can move on to the panel. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to dive into these questions and wanted to express my gratitude for you all taking the time to serve on this panel. My first question is for you, Alan. In your paper, Visibility into AI Agents, you discuss why and how increasing visibility measures are necessary for governing agents. what's the state of play of visibility right now? What kind of agents is it most important to get visibility into, and how are we doing on that?
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so maybe as a first thing, one thing I should say is like I'm just not sure it's like that useful anymore to talk about agents in general because it feels like every new product or something is an agent. I think at least recently in my research, I think it's been a lot more useful to think about specific domains of application. So yeah, maybe just going by rough product category or domains and thinking about visibility there. So two categories that come to mind are like web agents. So, your agent is just on the internet, can use a web browser, maybe he's on social media. And maybe another type of agent is like coding agents, which, we're maybe familiar with, like Cloud Code, that can help us write programs and are increasingly being used to, automate the AI R&D process. So how's visibility going there? So for web agents specifically, there's been increasing calls to label AI activity online. One example top of mind for a lot of people here, maybe on this panel, is Article 50 of the AI Act, which requires that AI content and interactions online have to be labeled as such. So if I see something produced by an AI system, an AI company, according to the AI Act, has to label it as AI generated. And if I'm interacting with some sort of chatbot online, I have to know that it's a chatbot and not a human. So I think overall this is probably a good step forward. Like just knowing that something is an AI system probably isn't going to be harmful. But so far, Article 50 only requires, or basically the legislation proposed worldwide and also particularly in the EU, only requires that content is labeled as AI generated. This doesn't really seem like it's going to be enough to address stuff like manipulation or like scams, because it seems that some research suggests that labeling something just as AI generated doesn't really affect whether somebody believes in the content or not. So this is like the motivation behind a lot of this legislation. It doesn't seem like we're going far enough yet. What more might you need? Overall, I think it's like quite unclear, but potentially additional information about provenance, like the public key of the person or organization that created the content. So that's sort of one thing that's missing from current legislation. Another sort of thing that I think is going to be a pretty important, I guess, trend over the next few years is we're going to see more and more platforms both like adapting to and built for web agents. So maybe people here are familiar with like the Moltbook stuff that happened a while ago, or maybe is happening right now, where like a bunch of agents are like sort of just like interacting with each other on this thing that's like sort of like Reddit, right? And just like saying stuff. I think it's like a pretty fun social experiment, and I basically expect that in the future there are going to be a lot more platforms like this to enable agents, like our personal assistants to like interact with each other and like do collaborative projects with each other, like make software projects. And it's going to be important to like just as it's important right now for combating like digital crime for law enforcement to like cooperate with like existing digital platforms. I think it's probably going to be important for like third parties and the government to get visibility into like the platforms that these agents are going to be on in the future. It's not really clear to me there's like an actionable thing right now, but that's like an important trend. And just super briefly, the next sort of category of thing that I think is pretty big is like coding agents, right? Especially how coding agents are used internally at AI companies. One important application is like, as I said before, automating AI R&D. If we were actually able to automate AI R&D, I think that could be pretty significant. There could be pretty important effects on like how fast AI progress goes, and also implications on how much meaningful oversight humans have over AI development. Unfortunately, I think right now we don't have a great sense of how much coding agents are able to do and how much they're actually doing. Our benchmarks are being saturated, and we really only have qualitative, vibes-based survey like observations of the extent to which aides are actually doing these AI R&D tasks. Soon we're going to have a paper out on what else we should be tracking, to understand AI R&D and the extent to which coding agents are doing this. But overall, I think much more work needs to be done in this direction. So maybe just to sum up, I think overall some progress has been made in the past few years on getting visibility into at least these two important kinds of agents, but there could be much more work on content provenance for web agents, understanding how coding agents are used within AI companies, and overall keeping our eye out for like new kinds of product categories and domains that agents are going to be used for in the near future.
Right, thank you so much. And I have a quick follow-up question. Is your overall perception a optimistic one when it comes to using labels to kind of monitor and keep track of agent activities, or not so much?
Tough question. Basically, not sure. I think like right now we're kind of fine, but it's unclear if we will continue to be fine as agents are just much more capable of doing basically reaching human level capability and above.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. And my next question is for Marta. Organizations are increasingly integrating AI agents into mission-critical tasks. How do you envision human workers and AI agents collaborating, and what governance mechanisms are necessary to ensure both the responsible and successful integration of these systems into organizational workflows?
Um, well, thank you so much, Nada, first of all, for inviting me to the event. And also, I wanted to say it was an absolute pleasure to see you developing it and putting the report through the peer review and all the iterations. I really think that all the thought and research you did, that you dedicated to mapping the landscape of challenges for the governance of agentic AI is really, really impressive. So congratulations to you and all of the team members. And going back to your question about the responsible and successful integration of agentic AI systems into human workflows. So I kind of try to employ theory of mind and try to say something that other panelists will not say today. So I think we all care about meaningful human agency. And when we talk about mission critical tasks, I think the biggest challenge is understanding how automation is impacting our decision making as humans. And it's about enhancing our performance safely and also contestability of the automated decision making. So in particular, I think we need to carefully study the cumulative and cascading effects of AI integration on human organizations. And I think this is something that Deepika has already mentioned. So if it's done right, AI can strengthen human decision making. Done wrong can harm the organization and the public interest. So right now, as you know, as I think the best at the minute. There is very little regulation or infrastructure to provide guidance on how to introduce and deploy agents into organizations. And AI, adopt or die, is the memo that goes around so many sectors at the minute. And people are introduced to agents as software as services or using credits to delegate some tasks to them, or even as virtual colleagues. In each case, unspoken responsibility for the quality of gatekeeping relies on the human user. So this is the case, for example, for the use of AI in medical services setting. AI agent is not a medical device and does not undergo ethical board review, for example, to assess the impact of its deployment. So this can, for example, lead to attribution failure, where responsibility is distributed across multiple actors with no clear causal chain. And importantly, the risks might not emerge from faults of individual agents, but from the interactions between network of AI agents and humans. And this is something you already mentioned in your report. So third-party auditing, or the currently popular idea about IVOs in the US, could be a real game changer, giving us independent lens on AI systems auditing for safety and trust, and incentivizing some of the monitoring and logging infrastructure you mentioned in the report. So the big question, I think, is how much monitoring is proportionate, what transparency measures are needed. And to me, responsible integration starts with defining the design of the human-machine teaming. Humans should act as supervisors, mentors, and collaborators, and machine can be collaborators, mentors, or even supervisors in certain workflows. But the oversight must remain human-centered and machine remain cooperative. So we need to integrate AI agents to the existing normative systems or build new ones. Before deployment, any agents, whether operating inside the or outside the organization, should be simulated in realistic multi-agent scenarios, stress tested with risk management proportional to the use case. So to sum up, from my point of view, we can achieve responsible and successful integration of AI agents if we combine flexible governance, thoughtful simulation, and monitoring, with the first blueprint being your AI profile that sets standards of care for the future. And think deeply about human-machine teaming and look back maybe to some of the social sciences to evaluate the benefit of integration of agentic AI. And I think this is the path forward.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you so much, Marta. And I agree with what you said. I think particularly the transparency part seems like it's going to be really important as we kind of even continue to understand how agents work. My next question is for Benjamin. The term agentic AI and AI agents have been defined in many different ways, and this divergence is often attributed to the differences in the degree of autonomy these systems employ. The World Economic Forum's recent publication offers guidance on a range of characteristics such as the level of autonomy, use case domain, operational context, so on and so forth, that can be used to classify these systems for effective adoption of governance. From a risk management perspective, how can we identify when systems cross the line from merely being automated to being meaningfully agentic? And how can these additional characteristics be used to support that assessment?
Yeah, thank you, Nada. I think that's a great question, and especially important to also go further into the definitions of what do we even mean when we're talking about an agent. I think, Alan, to your point, all of a sudden everything becomes an agent, but in reality, it's much more nuanced than that, of course. So to the first part of your question, how I view it is that once a system, it essentially starts making its own decisions, then it can be called agentic or an agent. And then, of course, the risk profile, it has to change in a meaningful way as well. So for me, I would say that agentic is fundamentally about autonomy, which is defined or can be defined as the capacity of a system to act essentially. And in terms of how to clarify or determine, is it automation or is it agentic? I would say that there are a couple of things that I usually look for here, Nada. One is linked to deciding how to pursue a goal, essentially. And you can say here that traditional automation, that would be executing on predefined function. It's much more deterministic. Versus agentic systems are able to effectively interpret goals at runtime. They can decide how to break down goals and what to prioritize and how to go about achieving a specific goal. So I would say that in short, you can view it as this. So automation, that would be about execution reliability, and autonomy, that's much more about decision-making flexibility. And I think that's really where we need to embrace a mindset shift. So essentially, you need an entirely different governance model when it's about decision-making at runtime, essentially. So the second point that I want to make here, that's linked to actions across systems. And again, here, when we're looking at automation, that would usually be in a much more narrow and more defined boundary or task boundary. And agents, it's much more open-ended. Now we're looking at access to tools. We're looking at access to different data sources, to different environments paired with this probabilistic nature at runtime for some parts of an architected system. But this is also, I think, where Deepika mentioned that risks, they can essentially start to spread. So a decision that's made in one part of the agentic system that could have consequences somewhere else. And it can often be hard to measure or anticipate this in advance, essentially. Then the third thing I want to mention is operating over time. And here, automation, that would typically be kind of a run and stop. So it completes a task and then exits, or it starts the same task all over again, essentially. And agentic systems, they can persist. And I think this is very important to understand. So they can keep state. There's the notion of memory, and there are much longer task and time horizons that agents, they can be engaged in. And this is certainly a field that's under development as well. So I think, again, from a risk perspective here, this is super important because problems, they can build up over time, and you're no longer dealing with kind of one-off areas, but you can also have drift in the system, and that's something that has to be grounded in proper evals and so on. So here at the World Economic Forum, where I sit, we've been working on agents for the past 2 years. And in last November, we had a paper on AI agents in actions, foundations for evaluation and governance. And one of the core contributions here that we are making is a set of classification dimensions that are designed to support progressive governance, essentially. So we're looking at autonomy, and I just mentioned a few characteristics there. We're looking at authority, so that's essentially the access rights of the systems. We're looking at the role, is it a specialist or a generalist system? Its level of predictability, which parts of the agent is architected as being deterministic, essentially, versus probabilistic or non-deterministic, and what is the degree of kind of design that goes into that. And then, of course, the environment of operation. Is it very static or is it very dynamic, such as a personal AI assistant and the environment that would operate in, for example? So these characteristics, they tell you how the system is intended to operate, essentially, and that helps you understand and also define what could go wrong in terms of deployment and use. And I think from here, you can do a few important things that I just briefly want to mention. The first is that you can begin to map. So you can map autonomy to explicit permission scopes like read, write, transact, communicate, delegate, and so on. And this is also a report or a very important element that's highlighted in your report. So here we can begin to ground governance in what the agent is authorized to do. And I think that's a very important element that I would like to stress. The second point that I want to mention here, that is that governance, it has to be designed based on context. And we've already talked a little bit about this. Marta, you mentioned this as well. And that takes a much broader look at the system of operation and not just an agent in isolation. And here it's really important to assess, well, how is the agent being integrated in an organization? What are the structural practices around that? Because there's a lot of governance layers and mechanisms that go into the organizational and structural approaches as well. So the last point that I briefly want to mention is that for agentic systems that change their behavior over time, this really, it demands a mindset shift as well towards, again, continuous evaluation. And that's something that has to be embodied across the organization. And it has to be embraced by employees as well, in charge of interacting with and overseeing agents or agentic systems. So perhaps just to sum up a few of the key points that I have here, I would say that maybe my main takeaway is that agent classification that should drive and should be linked to driving proportional oversight that's tied directly to some of the characteristics that I mentioned, as well as the full context of operation. I think those are some key points, and would be happy to explore that further in this conversation.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Benjamin. I have a follow-up question. So we discussed, or you discussed all of the different dimensions or all the different components of AI agents. Do you see the governance levers largely staying the same, but being just to various degrees? Or do you think that certain dimensions are going to require different types of governance levers if they reach a certain point?
Yeah, I think it's something that can be calibrated. Not to anthropomorphize too much, but similar to when, for example, you're onboarding a human employee into an organization, you wouldn't give that new employee access rights to all data sources across all parts of the system. So I think we kind of have to think and calibrate our thinking in terms of, if you are having an agent that's supposed to perform a given function, then what is the level of authority in terms of the access rights that the agent should have? And based on the given scope of a task or an action or a workflow, then what should its calibrated capabilities to act? What should that be? And it can be a system and an architecture design, but it has to be in an organizational context and reality. I think the other extreme is, of course, that you can even now produce computer use agents that have access to everything and they can do everything. But obviously that there's so much unpredictability associated with that it would not really be feasible to implement or use such a system, even though possible in theory today. So I think it has to be calibrated to context and use case, and they are kind of scaling up and down the level of autonomy, the access rights, and so on.
Thank you so much. I agree with that, and thank you for expanding on it. My next question is for Crystal. Agentic AI often has access to expanded operational environments, and it's also given access to external systems, databases, and tools, which can widen the attack surfaces. With this expanded scope of operation, what are some of the most critical safety and security vulnerabilities that can emerge? How do agentic capabilities introduce new or qualitatively different attack surfaces compared to non-agentic systems? and how should these risks be accounted within the risk management frameworks?
Yeah, thank you, Nada. Kind of a big multi-part question, so I'm going to try my best to kind of offer just like a little bit at a high level about fundamental vulnerabilities for agentic systems, and then I'll provide just one specific example. But definitely want to highlight, if you want a full list of kind of the risks and vulnerabilities for agent systems, definitely the OWASP top 10 for agentic applications is the place to go for that full list. But I'll just talk about one of their top ones. But at a high level, the vulnerability that we really need to watch with these systems, it's also the number one vulnerability for LLMs in general, which is this issue of being able to distinguish system instructions from data. So you have this issue where, the guardrails and the system prompts are processed in the same manner as the user input, emails, files that are uploaded. And so this provides attackers an opportunity to give illegitimate instructions and kind of take over the agent in certain ways. So when we're thinking about the risks from agentic applications, it's not just this, okay, they have access to tools and therefore the attack surface is expanded. That's certainly true, but it's kind of this combination of some of the pieces that Benjamin was just talking about, the autonomy, the privilege, the access, combined with this vulnerability makes for a very dangerous situation. So you could kind of think about this in contrast as well to an operating system where obviously our OS has a lot of access and privilege as well, a lot of tools at its disposal, but we don't think about the risks to operating systems the same way as we would agents because there's this nice clear distinction between instructions and code. So with that kind of context in mind, the number one vulnerability to kind of look out for agents is agent goal hijacking. So this is when a malicious actor embeds some kind of instructions into something that is otherwise, kind of benign, and the agent follows these instructions, either not pursuing its original instructions, or it's maybe doing this malicious activity on the side in a kind of covert way and still following its instructions. And so you can see how this would be, present a lot of different risks in various situations depending what the agent has access to and its privileges and so forth. And so this is really distinct, it's still the prompt injection as the central risk, but it's a distinct risk or an elevated risk because we're not just concerned about one single output being malicious or flawed in some way. We're really worried about an agent being completely derailed in its goals. And when you have, systems that are reasoning and planning and engaged in multi-step, execution of tasks, you can really kind of divert them on goals that are completely different from what you intended. So one example of this that was kind of not a attack that was taken advantage of, to my knowledge, in the wild, but kind of just demonstrated as a proof of concept was Echo Leak. And so this took advantage of Microsoft's Copilot, had those hidden instructions and got the agent to exfiltrate confidential emails, files, and chat logs without any user interaction whatsoever. This has since been remedied, but it's a really great example if you want a data point there. Some other data points was NIST did some really good research as well around agent hijacking and kind of showed across a couple of different injection tasks that you could get quite high success rates for attacks across popular agents that they tested at the time. And this is also very dangerous because it can be used in combination with other risks, such as tool calling and chaining tools together. And so I think about this one a lot because you can have a system that has, pretty good boundaries on its privileges and its access. It only has legitimate tools available to it, but it's able to use all of these legitimate tools kind of in a chain to illegitimate ends. So it would be really hard to be able to, catch it in action if you've already given access to database, you've already given access to internal APIs, and now suddenly there is like exfiltrating sensitive logs, right? So you would have to set up quite a lot of guardrails and filtering in order to catch some of these behaviors. So, how do we mitigate some of these risks? Obviously, enforcing least privilege and limiting autonomous action, maintaining comprehensive logging, and continuous monitoring of agent activity, top of mind. I think also validating at important points of the agent process if it's still driving towards the goal in the way that you would think. So, checking in on agent behavior from time to time to make sure it's not, making a ton of database calls that you wouldn't anticipate or something that's kind of would, raise a red flag. But if you want to be really safe, and I think one of the few ways to make sure you limit your risk is isolated environments and sandboxing, if you want to be completely sure. Because otherwise, when we talk about establishing least privilege, one of the issues here is while that is, of course, great security best practice, one of the benefits of agents is that they're able to do things pretty autonomously without a lot of human input. And we don't always have or don't always want to be responsible for configuring, how an agent can use every single tool we wanted to have access to, in super fine grained detail. And so that becomes, configuration errors in and of themselves is a huge security risk and opportunity for exploitation. So I think that there's kind of a tension there for a lot of security folks in that, hey, I want to implement this system to reduce work, but if I have to think about everything that it touches and making sure that all of my configurations and all of my access is, perfect every single time, that becomes quite a challenge, right? So I think leaning into kind of the sandboxing and maybe isolation approach might be good, at least in the short term, as you start to figure out what exactly agents need to access or not within your environment.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I completely agree with that, especially the sandboxing and having an isolated approach. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And you had briefly mentioned NIST. So speaking of NIST, this is a question for all of the panelists. So please feel free to jump in if you have an answer. The Center for AI Standards and Innovation, or CAISI, at NIST has recently issued a request for information on security considerations for AI agents covering threats and vulnerabilities, security practices, assessment methods, and deployment controls. If you could influence one aspect of this request for information, or RFI, what would you prioritize, and what risks would you choose to address? Would you choose to address?
Happy to jump in from my side, because I think it dovetails nicely with all you just mentioned, Crystal. I think from my point of view, clearer guidance on authority-based risk classification for agents is something that's top of mind. Current kind of conversations, they tend to focus a lot on autonomy levels and how to understand autonomy and threat taxonomies and so on. But I think authority, that's really key to help determine what is the kind of anticipated radius of interaction and accountability, and also legal exposure in terms of overextending into certain databases, or overextending kind of the authority in terms of access rights. And I think what you mentioned, Crystal, in terms of least privilege, that's something that's very important to look at. I think also silent kind of over delegation, where agents, they accumulate permissions over time, is something that has to be watched for. And then I would also mention misalignment between technical evaluation and organizational responsibility as well, because access rights is something that has to be looked at from both an integration perspective, whether that's from a technical angle or viewpoint, but also from an organizational lens. So I think if we get this kind of authority mapping right, and then many other governance and security issues, they may fall into place more naturally.
Yeah, I can say some stuff. So maybe related. I think they should do two things. One is literally just write a guidebook of up-to-date / emerging best practice on what to do about prompt injections. I think mostly tailored towards agent developers. Since, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff scattered in the academic literature. It's not clear how helpful that actually is in production. It's also not clear what the frontier labs are doing. So to the extent, possible because of commercial sensitivity or whatever, it'd be good if NIST or, I think NIST is probably the best body to just compile the existing best practice. The second thing is something around like a guidebook for how to configure permissions properly for agents that you're deploying. So this would be tailored towards users or deployers. I mean, I think my basic intuition here is like, surely there is a better way of doing things than just telling Claude Code dangerously skip permissions, you know? And probably you have to start with like a specific, yeah, maybe you have to start with like software engineering specifically, right? Just like go and interview, you know, people who have adopted Claude Code to understand how you can actually use Claude Code while at the same time maintaining security of your code base. But yeah, I think that will also be quite useful.
Yeah, I just want to jump in quickly because completely agree with both Benjamin and Alan. I want to piggyback off the first thing that Alan said for some practical guidance for prompt injection. Since I was talking about it so much, I would love to see some guidance on that piece in particular. There's some emerging research on separating out instructions from code. You kind of have this like Google DeepMind paper, a Camel, and these other like academic kind of, as you mentioned, papers out there. But there is nothing that is kind of open source tooling or best practice or standards or any kind of metrics that we could use to say, okay, this is the degree to separation that is okay, or something that you could actually use in a production environment. And so that would be super useful to see come out of NIST.
I'm just going to very quickly jump in because I know it will resonate with you. I would like to see a little bit more on multi-agent cybersecurity challenges. And so far, NIST has not engaged really with the system level challenges. So I would hope this is going to be a first step.
Thank you so much for weighing in on this, everyone. Kind of a follow-up question to all of the panelists. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about, within a multi-agent system, is it better to have several agents, each with their distinct roles and distinct access, or have fewer agents, but then these fewer agents might each have more access or several roles?
I'll jump in really quickly also to echo something that I think Benjamin mentioned, that context is key. So I think it would depend a lot on the organization, the kind of risk that they face, what they're doing specifically with these agents. But I would lean towards, without too much information, saying that it seems like the lots of agents with little permissions approach probably is better in most contexts. But again, it would really depend on the deployment context.
Yeah, absolutely. The context will definitely.
Now, that's not a direct answer to your question, but I think even this kind of notion of a multi-agent system, because many agentic systems today, if you look beneath the hood, they would essentially be composed of multiple sub-agents. So I think even there, starting with definitional clarity on when we start talking about multi-agent systems, do we mean one agent that's maybe composed of many sub-agents that is interacting with other agents that may be composed of sub-agents as well? And it's that agent-to-agent interaction that we begin to consider a multi-agent system? Or do we even consider, in some aspects, a single agent as a multi-agent system because it's configured of many sub-agents that have much more specialized tasks in the sequence of performing a given workflow and so on. So I think definitional clarity there, but I would say in a kind of a cautious way that I would definitely agree with Crystal's take as well so far.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll push back. At the end of the day, I think it's like an empirical question, but like having a bunch of agents with not too many permissions is maybe a good way of getting nothing done. So I think in practice, organizations probably just not gonna do that. They might just try the dangerously skip permissions thing first.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. All right. This next question is also for all of the panelists, so please jump in if you would like to chime in on this. We've discussed that there is often limited consensus around the definitions and concepts of AI agents and agentic AI. From your perspective, what are some of the common misconceptions about AI agents or agentic AI that are the most important to clarify for the purpose of effective governance?
Yeah, so I can say some stuff to get us started. So maybe my controversial take is, I don't think the definition of an agent actually matters that, or it hasn't mattered that much so far, because for what we've been using the definition of an agent for, like it hasn't actually, the price definition hasn't actually affected our conclusions that much. So thinking about, for example, like what kinds of risks we're interested in, right? Like you think about an agent as something that interacts with the environment, it uses tools. You think about it as something that like is autonomous, like take all your definitions, like roughly you end up sort of in the same spot with respect to the risks and what sort of technical mitigations you end up needing to apply. I think where the rubber might hit the road in the future and like where more precise definition might actually matter is if you actually want to make agents a regulatory category. So, some academics right now are writing papers on whether we should give AI systems or AI agents legal personhood, whether they should hold property, what sort of legal implications this has. I think like if you want to do that, then the definition really does matter quite a lot. But yeah, otherwise, I think in general, people tend to focus too much on the precise definition of an agent, and I don't think it's actually that helpful after a certain point.
Yeah, that is helpful though, because that is a misconception in itself that the definition serves a different purpose than it might.
I'll just jump in here quickly as well. But I generally agree that maybe at this point the legal definition is not particularly important. Where I do think it might be more important is just at the level of people like trying to acquire software. So one of the things that I thought about with this question is I think it's actually really important that we don't advertise LLMs and agents as the same thing, or at least confuse them when marketing or adopting these in more of an enterprise setting, because I think for a lot of people they're so different from traditional software products that it might be very difficult for them to understand like the gravity of implementing them, all of the security risks that are associated. And so I'd really like to see more responsibility, I guess, for lack of a better word, from developers in, offering up agents with specific design choices that prioritize privacy and security and make it very explicit and easy for people to understand when they're making certain trade-offs so that they don't think that it's the same as an LLM and they kind of understand the complexity there, and maybe also couple it with specific security tools and guidance that come along with systems so that all of the onus of protecting isn't on the person implementing the agent. But yeah.
Perhaps two follow-up reflections from my side. I think one is that we, of course, having this conversation today, and there's a lot more focus on agents. But if we take a step back, it's still very early days when it comes to agents. And a lot of this is something that's emerging. It's really the very frontier of both what are the systems, agentic systems, technically capable of doing today versus how fast is that advancing in weeks, months, or perhaps even the next couple of years. So for sure, it's very important to have these conversations. But in terms of misconceptions, what we are seeing and what we're hearing from our side is that because it is such a nascent field and because it's moving so fast at the frontier, that there seems to be two sides of the same story that are true at the same time. And that is that one, agents, they are kind of nascent, they're brittle, they tend to fail, and they don't deliver on the promised hype and so on. But we're also hearing at the same time that agents are actually delivering some pretty remarkable results at the very frontier of application. When you have kind of the necessary technical know-how and it's paired with the right kind of model and you have the right orchestration setup and database and integration and so on. So I think it's not as much a misconception. It's more that there seems to be many things that are true at the same time here. And Alan, that goes to your point of definitions. I think it's certainly important to have a good and grounded conceptual understanding of what are the partial elements and aspects that go into an agent in a context, and based on that, understanding what are the governance levels and layers, but also realizing that much more work it needs to be done here because it's such a rapidly changing field. So it's great that we're having this conversation, and I think over time that also contributes to greater definitional clarity. and to a shared understanding of what are the areas and aspects that we really need to double click on right now, because we can already see that the field is progressing very fast. And based on that, there will be a number of governance implications that are linked to greater degrees of freedom associated with autonomy to operate in different environments. So that would perhaps be my take.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Right. I just want to jump in and reiterate again that I think sometimes people are using, when we're talking about misconception, the word agents to describe different things. And you already picked up on this in your profile. There are different levels of autonomy. There are different applications. Humans are also agents in multi-agent system. So I think at times it's really important to also note who is deploying the agent, or whether the agents are, created by other agents, right? So there's so much confusion in the space that I think it's always important to define who is the deployer, what the agent is supposed to do, what is the task supposed to be achieved, and the scope of autonomy.
Thank you so much, Marta. And yeah, to reiterate what Benjamin said, it's great that we're having this conversation. It definitely needs to be an ongoing conversation. I would like to move on to some of the audience questions. Thank you so much, all of you who provided some questions for us. One question is, the resources section of the profile is quite useful. Could you discuss 2 to 3 examples of mitigations that work well for AI agents, for example, red teaming or others, versus have not produced good results so far, for example, watermarking? Or to ask it in a different way, are there mitigation strategies that can be useful for general purpose AI, but wouldn't really be as useful in an agentic AI setting?
Yeah, so I can take a shot at this. So on that latter version of the question, I think probably all of the mitigations that we're using for general purpose AI are just useful for the agents that at least the frontier companies are building. In terms of what's effective or not, I guess to me that's not really the right question. I guess I have more of a defense in depth type of perspective on this. So like, yeah, let's just like throw it all in and see at the end of the day what's like cost effective, and what ends up actually giving us the safety outcomes that we want. In terms of what has seemed surprisingly effective, though, I guess, yeah, one thing I'm sort of surprised by is how I'm not going to say easy, but how like relatively straightforward alignment has been so far. Potentially, it's because the models we have are not that capable, and they are actually becoming much more evaluation aware. But yeah, it doesn't really seem like we've had to solve like super thorny conceptual challenges so far to get our AI systems to roughly do what we want them to do for like most of the time. There are important edge cases, that fail, but using techniques like constitutional AI and deliberative alignment seem like they take us quite far, which I think I would have been surprised by like 5 years ago or something. So that seems to be working quite well. In terms of the thing that's not really working that well, yeah, I guess it's to be seen how effective, the watermarking and the identification stuff actually is. There doesn't really seem to be that many cost benefit analyses of like either watermarking or something like C2PA. So I don't know, like as we roll this out, and especially as Article 50 gets implemented, I think we'll start seeing whether it actually is having an impact or not.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Alan. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up today's event?
Perhaps I'd just jump in again and say that it is such a fast-moving space. So again, Nada, I appreciate you and the team's work on this, and very excited to dive further into the report. And congrats on the publication. And I think from my point of view, with agents continuing to unfold, I think direction is only going in one way right now. And I think what we've debated here in terms of autonomy, authority, and access, and the direction of travel, that there's a lot more to unpack in the time to come, and certainly also a lot of promise. But again, I think it's very important that we do have these conversations and get the governance levels and mechanisms right, because of course, when handing over a set of actions to a system to perform these actions, we need to be sure and certain, and to have kind of guarantees that yes, there's alignment and anticipation that the system will actually perform as intended. So again, congrats on the report, and looking forward to more of these conversations in the future.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. And this is a great point to end on. As we wrap up today's event, if any of the panelists would like to highlight any of your work in the chat, please feel free to add the link in the chat right now as we're wrapping up. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our presenters and panelists, Deepika, Marta, Crystal, Alan, Benjamin. We really appreciate your time and your expertise that you provided today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And truly appreciate everyone who joined today and everyone who participated.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.